Well, maybe what we can do is move on to what Darwin's theory really is, because people think, you know, the unscientific ones of us, we think Darwin, evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
from what I've learned, that really he did not, evolution is not his theory.
No, that's true. Evolution is an idea that has been around for a long time, you know, at least, well, in some guise in antiquity it existed. You know, certain Greek philosophers talked about a kind of evolutionary process. But really the idea of transformation of organisms in serious scientific dialogue was around 100 years or more prior to Darwin himself. In fact, his grandfather, Erasmus, on his father's side, wrote about evolution, had a kind of quasi-evolutionary notion, but the word evolution was never used in that context. It was always transmutation or transformation. Evolution was something actually reserved for describing embryological development for quite a long time.
Uh-huh.
So yes, you're right. Darwin's real contribution here was not the idea of evolution. What Darwin was able to accomplish was really two things. Number one, The Origin of Species represents a really masterful synthesis of data, of observations from an astonishing diversity of fields that brought together in one place one coherent argument for the reality of some kind of transmutation. That transmutation must have occurred. It is, let us say, the most reasonable, most parsimonious explanation for the patterns seen in various areas, whether that's, you know, biogeography or the fossil record or behavior and morphology and so forth. So evolution wasn't original with Darwin, but he was the first to actually make a scientifically compelling case for it. Now, the reason, in large part, why it was scientifically compelling was more than just demonstrating that it must have occurred, but for the first time, a plausible mechanism was proposed. And that's really Darwin's key insight, his main contribution. He, along with Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently formulated this idea, he was the first to hit upon a natural mechanism of evolutionary change that could explain these patterns that he was saying. The evolutionary systems that were proposed prior to him were all very, very different and often quasi-supernatural, that involved some kind of unspecified internal complicating force or process, so that organisms would almost of their own volition become altered in response to their interaction with the environment. And that just didn't pass muster when you really began to look at that, scrutinize that scientifically. So the leading scientists of the early 19th century could not see any plausible mechanism, so they thought it's just unlikely that this actually happens. So that's really Darwin's key contribution there, was convincing them that it happened, and here's a candidate mechanism that makes sense.
So this is the natural selection, like survival of the fittest, that there's mutations and then whatever survives best gets passed down to succeeding generations. Is that sort of...
In a nutshell, yes, that's the idea. I mean, there's of course more to it than that.
Yeah.
Survival of the fittest, by the way, was a phrase of the day, coined actually by the philosopher Herbert Spencer. It was not Darwin's preferred term, and so he resisted using it actually for quite a while. Natural selection to him was a process by which, yes, there would be variations generated, and now we would call those mutations.
Right.
He didn't have any knowledge of genetics or the nature of these variations, but just the idea that virtually every trait of organisms varied naturally in some way, and truly universally. This would be internal physiological traits, details of anatomy and physiology, even behavior has a genetic basis, as we now recognize. Instinct, for example, and even this can vary. And he postulated then that in a world with tremendous population pressure, he was inspired by the writings of the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, who first talked about this disconnect between the tremendous population pressure. Organisms' reproductive output is such that populations grow exponentially, and yet sustenance and such for those organisms, if it grows at a much slower pace, and so inevitably there is a significant proportion of populations that simply don't make it. Now which individuals do make it to secure whatever resources they need or secure mates and such? Is it purely chance or not? And Darwin postulated that and Wallace as well, that it's not purely chance, that in some significant measure the persistence, reproductive success, survivorship, and all of that has to do with the particular variants that those individuals have, their endowment, their natural, as we would call it, genetic endowment. And so there is a differential that can result over long periods of time in a change in the population's genetic makeup.
Well, now we understand this so much through genetics, but as you said, that the genetics weren't there at the time. Darwin and scientists at that time did not have an understanding of genetics. So has that changed the way we think of Darwin's theory, or has it just confirmed it?
It hasn't changed it. It has helped us more fully understand the nuances of the mechanism. It's interesting that Darwin could formulate an explanation for evolutionary change that is fundamentally correct, right? Does not depend on a detailed understanding of genetics, of heredity, really. Mm-hmm. This was his greatest frustration. He struggled mightily to understand the nature of heredity. He performed a multitude of experiments. He corresponded with a multitude of scientists who were studying hybridization and crossing and experiments and trying to figure out the nature of variation and the transmission of what we would call genetic information. And after The Origin of Species was published, in the late 1860s, he published a theory of heredity, which is called pangenesis, and it was completely incorrect. It was simply wrong. He tried mightily. The real understanding really didn't come about until about the turn of the century. Gregor Mendel, the monk whose classic work, Crossing Peas, helped us understand transmission genetics. His work was done in the 1860s, ironically, while Darwin was still alive. But even so, it's unlikely that even had Darwin known about his work, the time doesn't seem to have been quite right to really appreciate what Mendel's work meant. And it's interesting that that time seemed to be right around the year 1900, 1901, when 3 different scientists independently read Mendel's work, and suddenly something clicked, a light bulb went off, and they recognized this is the key to heredity. And of course, it took quite a lot more time to figure out the essence of heredity in terms of identifying DNA and the structure of DNA and exactly how DNA replication works and traits are transmitted. So that understanding, I think, has helped tremendously understand the nature of the variation that Darwin's theory depended on and argued must be there. But Darwin himself did not have any kind of understanding of those processes.
Among scientists, is there any dispute about?
No, I mean among biologists today, this is the bedrock of the modern biological sciences. The theory is foundational and truly central. As the famous earlier 20th century evolutionary geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky had said. You know, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. I mean, it's truly foundational. So are there scientists that disagree that evolution occurs? Yes, only rarely are they credentialed biologists. They're often not. They're often, you know, they may work in other fields in the physical sciences. But even there, they're quite a minority. So it's truly foundational.